So Barry Hankin from JBA is going to present the first challenge on nature-based solutions. Barry, just go ahead.
Okay, thanks Arno, and thanks for inviting me to give this. I work for JBA Consulting, and I'm kind of standing in for Rob Lamb from the JBA Trust. I've done a lot of NFM, natural flood management, or emulated natural flood management modelling in recent times. And I think at the moment, like Arno says, it's a case of needing a hybrid method. So I think the community is aware that generally you'll need a kind of NFM to supplement established flood risk management measures. But then there's lots of communities out there who are trying to do something. And what we want really is strategies to help them decide where to target. So for instance, I'll give you a bit of background about some of the projects that I've been involved with. We had some European funding to make strategies over catchments that are about 500 kilometres squared in the Lake District and so on. So is there any kind of patterns of NFM, of storage and slowing the flow that would help them target where to put them more effectively? So the contents of this, so I'll just talk a bit about the definitions of working with natural processes. It's called a big range of things, and I quite like the idea of calling it nature-based because none of it's natural. Some background to our involvement, so some of the kind of research projects we've been involved with before leading into the challenge. And this really is all about sort of taking things down a peg to a smaller catchment and understanding are there as a sort of network problem for similar to what Arno's been talking about, really. I also want to talk a little bit about the effectiveness of distributed small-scale storage and being able to model that efficiently. So we might be modelling 500 kilometres squared at 2 metre resolution on our GPU machines using solutions to the shallow water equations and trying to understand how these features on a small scale could integrate up and have an effect on the flood peak downstream. But the problem is the evidence. So we can model these things, and it's a bit like a sensitivity analysis on with a computer model, but there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that they work at a scale bigger than sort of 10 kilometres squared. There's not a lot of evidence in the literature, and by that I mean kind of monitoring evidence. So nature-based solutions. They've been also called working with natural processes from the Pitt review after the summer floods in 2007. Natural flood management, natural water retention measures in Europe. There's sort of whole websites set up for looking at them. And I'm sorry you can't read the small print here, but we're talking about things like floodplain reconnection, runoff attenuation features where we temporarily store some of the flow in different parts of the catchment, measures tree planting on the floodplain to slow the flow, increase the roughness and the friction. So some definitions of what it means in taking action to manage fluvial and coastal flood and erosion risk by protecting, restoring and emulating the natural regulation function of catchments, rivers and floodplains. And people involved in the community are sort of well aware of the other benefits that they give, such as carbon storage and diffuse pollution. Slowing the flow tends to allow things to settle out for diffuse pollution, and particulates with things like nutrients can settle out. So in terms of risk management, so what we've been trying to do at JBA is kind of be able to model these kind of tree planting, distributed storage, soil and structure storage to store more of the water around the catchment, and try and put it on a level with sort of established flood risk management methods. So when you're sort of designing a scheme for a defence, or you build a model and you try to be quite precise, what we've been trying to do is kind of understand the effect of these small scale features which can impact multiple processes with very fuzzy evidence on how they do that at the larger scale. So we've been developing better modelling, like I mentioned about the 2D modelling. We've also been working with Lancaster University on using hydrological semi-distributed models. And I suppose what we want is, kind of where can we direct people like the Rivers Trust to sort of, they've got quite a large workforce of voluntary people and so on, and they want to do stuff for communities where they can't get this grant and aid funding to do traditional measures, and they want to do something. So we've also done things, we entered the DEFRA floods modelling competition and won that, where we looked at different sorts of rainfall, different extremes, we used spatial joint probability modelling, and varied the different forcing on the catchments, so the different rainfall events with realistic spatial extents. And we looked on average across those events how effective were these measures, because it depends where on big catchments, 2,000 kilometres squared, depends where the rainfall's coming from. So sometimes the NFM might be useful, sometimes it might be ineffective. People are just implementing NFM, and there's quite a lot of distrust about modelling as well because of all the assumptions. So previous projects I think I've talked about, but we did things like, science projects EA DEFRA funded for how to model and map natural flood management. There's a report and different sort of tools, but what you'll find is there's a myriad of tools, and it's more the kind of strategies for how you use these that's more important. There's a current evidence-based project on NFM trying to look for the gaps that JBA is leading on. There's a big consortium of people involved, and there are some big gaps, and I've already mentioned about the lack of evidence at the larger scale for different approaches to help with managing flood risk. We, the JBA Trust, through an internship at Lancaster, developed a sort of online catalogue which is trying to assess, so there's about 150 schemes around the country, although there's more than that, and in terms of where people are doing things like building small storage features that drain down between events. But some of the research came out of this was that very few of those, I think 6%, are monitored. So in terms of gathering evidence to try and understand how well these things are doing. We also had a multi-objective funded DEFRA project at Holnacut in the estate, and here we had quite precise measurements and NFM implemented, and yet it's still very difficult to detect change as a result of these features that you put in because of the natural variability. I mentioned about these large catchments in Cumbria, where what we've been trying to do is use our 2D overland flood modelling and at a 2-metre resolution and sort of give them advice on where to target. And we've been trying to do things like this, where we've got networks of rivers. So I'm getting onto the network problem with tree planting opportunities, and then we monitor from our sort of 2-metre resolution model at the poor points of these catchments how big an effect NFM might have, and then we colour theme the sub-catchments and say, well, you might want to target here better. But there's lots of things to think about, such as, well, how much downstream risk is that going to alleviate from that catchment as well? So, so our challenge centres around a sort of network problem for leaky barriers. So we've already seen some pictures of those. Can we create in-stream storage? And it could also be storage in terms of on the floodplain, because water being throttled and held on the floodplain. So there's growing interest, as we said, in nature-based flood risk management, and this, I suppose, is your practical type of thing that communities can do if they want to take matters into their own hands and they're trying to sort of slow the flow. Small-scale runoff attenuation features, which typically are leaky dams or barriers, so they're not controlled, made from wood, that allow low flows to pass through but hold back the high flows. So there's lots of environmental reasons, fish passing and so on, that you need to allow the slower flows to go past. So the hope is that a large collection of those deployed in a small stream channels may hold back enough flood water so as to mitigate flood risk downstream. So this one here is from the Brompton catchment, and it's quite small, but there's such interest at the moment that the local MP opened this one. So, it's kind of perhaps a bit disproportionate in some senses in terms of what we can do, and maybe what we really do need is some large controllable weirs further down. And I'm taking some of the data to help with the problem from Peter Metcalf's He's doing a PhD at Lancaster, and he's kindly given me some of his data from the Brompton catchment because it's got a small network, 26 kilometres squared in the North Yorkshire moors, so it's quite, it's got a severe history of flooding, most recently in 2012, and there are a number of constraints, like with any catchment, so you know it's particular to a catchment, is where in this catchment the agricultural land's quite valuable, so they don't want to sort of build lots of storage, so they want to sort of hold the flow within channel and do inline features rather than digging lots of ponds and having lots of floodplain storage. So can we do anything? So this is a network model. So Peter developed a 1D routing model and combined for the channel network, and every node has sort of experimented with putting in one of these barriers that's represented through a head loss in the model. And so the idea is we calibrate the model, which is it uses dynamic top model that then feeds the amount of flow into the channel for each of those segments, and get a good performance measure. So in terms of how well does the model reproduce the observations, quite often the observations, even if you've got some at this scale, and normally you have larger catchments that are monitored at gauging sites. So we've got a NAS uplift efficiency measure of about 0.9. So then the strategy was to apply underflow barriers from the highest reaches downstream. One of the things that he's found is, you know, you have to go to about 40 barriers before you do anything. So the challenge, oops, seems to have gone backwards. So we do have an animation of how those have those different features kind of fill up through the event. So I can show that later, perhaps, when we're looking at the challenge in more detail. But most barriers in the upper reaches are never used, so there's obviously not enough flow for them to start becoming effective. So it's this thing about effectiveness. And before, you know, sort of had to have about 59 features before we saw any kind of change to the peak. And he too had made the back calculation of the volume required and the peak flow reduction needed. So here we're talking about flows of about 19 Qmax. So because you know, people make comparisons with various things, you can talk about needing to reduce it from 19 tons per second, if you like, because a cubic metre per second is about a ton per second, so you can start talking about elephants per second and that sort of thing as well. But the idea was to reduce it by about 4. I think it needed to be reduced from 19 to 15 Qmax in order for the flooding in 2012 to be mitigated. But then we come to some of the network problems that start to arise. So there's a tributary here which is 39, and if we put certain features in place, after adding different barriers, we managed to synchronize the peaks on the two tributaries to make things worse. And quite often I've seen, sort of reported in some of the papers in the literature, you know, this is one of the sort of problems, is this synchronization of different channel peaks. So it's not only, so there's two things. So there's the effectiveness of the uptake of that storage dynamically, and then there's, hang on a minute, we're also making things worse, and we've seen that quite a lot. Certain catchment groups are trying to do things like speed up the flow in a neighbouring catchment to one where they're slowing it down and so on. Whereas what we've tended to sort of talk about is slowing it down in only one of the catchments where these things are closely timed. So the challenge is in understanding the performance and optimization of a system comprising a collection of individual runoff attenuation features like this, distributed spatially throughout a connected stream network. It's a difficult problem, and so we have been trying to sort of tackle it from a number of points of view, and we've been trying to sort of promote the idea of getting more monitoring data. DEFRA have just announced that they are going to fund £15 million worth of NFM to supplement existing schemes. And so lots of communities are about to sort of try and do that without much justification for the funding. They're just going to do these things, and part of the condition on the funding is to get some more observation data. There's also a big NERC grant at the moment, which different universities are trying to get to try and understand these features in more detail. But what we're talking about here is to sort of, with a network analysis, we want to generalize each RAF as an object that intercepts runoff within a flow pathway. Because, I mean, actually, quite often I'll show you some of the results from the 2D modelling. What we're trying to do is not just do that in channel, but also over the sort of uplands and the headwaters before the water gets into what you might define as a channel as well. And can we generalise the strategy to a full 2D? And then, so those release the flows more slowly. Those features can be envisaged as hydrological models, as conceptual storage elements or slow path filters, where the flood flow is a signal that is attenuated by the runoff attenuation feature. So the crux of the challenge lies in representing arbitrary collections of RAFs as a whole system within a stream network analysis. So we want to account for the performance and potential failure modes as well. So that's something that I haven't talked about. And we saw some of those photographs of these in-stream barriers, and quite a lot of people are also worried about failure or kind of, failures of systems of those. So what happens when one fails and the next one cascades, and we get lots of failure. And we can also, above urban areas, we can have things like wood and debris blocking other established risk management measures like culverts and so on. They could get blocked and then cause flooding upstream. We do also have the problem with attenuation in flowing. So we've done some 2D modelling of very flat areas as well, where we increase the Manning's roughness to represent something like slowing flow, planting trees, and it creates a backwater. The flood extent gets bigger, and then if there's a community upstream, it gets flooded. So that's another kind of failure, if you like. So we're interested in that kind of cascade failure, the propagation of flood waves through the network, the synchronization problem, which hopefully I've illustrated, cascade failures, and the dynamic utilization of the potential storage. So a network analysis, we hope, could prove useful in future support optimization. So we haven't really done a lot about sort of optimization, to be honest, in the work that we've done. It's been more about opportunity mapping and then looking at the benefits. So we also want to bring some of the complexity of a real system in. So some level of abstraction may be required. We should characterize it by realistic data. So I have brought some of Peter's data, or we could just sort of use, in steep areas, a flood wave may propagate at 2 meters per second, and in shallow 1 meter per second, and that sort of thing. But obviously we don't really necessarily want to repeat the kind of modelling approaches that we've used already. So in things like sort of numerical solutions to 1D equations and so on, it's not necessarily going down that line. So help us describe distinctive deployment, so sort of narratives for how we might deploy and maintain these things. So the other thing which I haven't mentioned, I mentioned sort of failure and cascade failure, but is through time, these things might fill up with sediment, they might become less useful. So we've also got this sort of change in performance, especially with the kind of offline runoff attenuation features when we don't have kind of faster flows and so on, which might scour out the sediment. So we might build in some sort of failure or gradual failure through its lifetime. So the sort of more detailed issues for discussion could include optimizing those spatial distribution nature-based interventions, considering those synchronization, underutilization, failure of stream storage, and cascade failure. So I think I've sort of covered all of that. But apart from the last point, which is, can the model be generalized to treatment of 2D surface runoff from a complex terrain, where we tend to use blanket rainfall, and it exposes a network of pathways, a much denser network of pathways than we might do from just looking at a river network. So the sort of conditioning data, I think we could talk about inflow boundaries, spatially and temporally, and variable. So sort of looking at event sets might be how we do it in an industrial point of view for insurance and so on. But we might just sort of vary these things systematically for a network analysis. We could talk about the slopes of the river reaches, leading to different celerities, wave speeds, and we could, for instance, have a minimum of 2 slope classes. We could have different length classes for these reaches, and we could have different friction, so we could just restrict ourselves to having sort of 2 or 3 of those. So I'll bring some of the data, I'll show you some of that shortly. So this is a little bit more from Peter's paper, which I can give you a reference, I'll probably give you a copy too. So this is from the 2012 flooding. So the peak was 19.2 Qmax. And he's estimated in a similar way to Ono to need to reduce that by a certain amount. The peak at Winton was thought to arrive, so this back here on this network was thought to arrive 30 minutes before Ing. So rather than trying to do anything in Winton Beck, they've targeted Ing Beck, and that's where we've tried to put these 59, I think it is, rather than 54 leaky barriers around Ing Beck. So are there any strategies for kind of, setting those up? And from his modelling, actually it's more to do with making use of the barriers further down and more sort of effective. So we've got different bits of data. We've got the node data with elevations. We've got the slopes along the segments of river, so the different river reaches. It's only about 4.5 kilometres long of network in this instance. But he wanted an additional storage of approximately 70,000 cubic metres is seen, and that gives us a reduction of about 11%. So using those sort of 59 features, we can hope to make that amount of extra storage, and that's not quite enough. That's only half of what's needed. So obviously it needs to be supplemented by other risk management if we're going to prevent something like the 2012 event from causing flooding. So I can provide this kind of data, or we can just make it up entirely. We can just, but we've got the data. We could make, into a network analysis. We could build a hydraulic model. I could help make something in HECRAS. And we've got some of the flow data. This is the peak after the confluence, and these are the 2 peaks before the 2 main tributaries join. So that's most of the challenge. I do have 5 minutes, I think, for questions, and I've got a few other things which I could show perhaps in the actual challenge session.
All right, thank you very much. Other questions? Could you speak up? I probably should give you the microphone. Yes, here. Because then it's good for the recording. I should have thought about, well, Jacques should have thought about it earlier. Where are you doing?
All good? Yeah. For the Brompton case,
Yeah.
is there a reason that there was only the focus on Ing Beck
Yeah.
and not on the other one?
I thought I'd explain that in terms of the timing of the synchronization. So the peak arrived 30 minutes later there. So the trouble is, if you slow the flow in the Winton Beck, you might then create a synchronization and make the peak worse.
No, thank you.
Other questions?
Hi. You mentioned...
Could you say your name?
Oh, hello, I'm James Franklin. You mentioned that the 59 interventions held back 70,000
Yeah.
cubic metres, so it's more than 1,000 cubic metres per intervention. Are they, the pictures you showed us, are they typical?
I think that they've only implemented a few of those, and that was on a smaller channel, so I think some of them will have to be quite a bit bigger.
Yeah, because 1,000 cubic
Yeah,
metres
yeah.
for those
Yeah.
structures that you showed seems,
I mean,
seems high.
This that figure of 70,000, and just to give you a comparison again, I think in Penrith there's a wildlife sort of wetland that they built with the Environment Agency and the local trust, and that was 80,000 cubic metres, so it's kind of like one of those. But when we're talking about major flood storage areas that the Environment Agency might use, say at Salford in Manchester, that might be 600,000 cubic metres. So, but you know, this is scale. This is such a small catchment.
Yeah, these are more.
Yeah.
Can I ask another question? Is that okay?
Sure.
Have you looked at what's the cost of one of those 59? Do you have an idea of cost and what benefits they offer in terms of flood damages avoided?
So I think we do have costs for one of those. We're talking a few hundred, but we're in terms of the benefits, we did do in the DEFRA competition a big kind of cost benefit analysis where the Eden catchment's 2,000 kilometres squared or 2,300, and in the upper sort of 250 kilometres squared, we planted about 65 square kilometres of trees in the model, and we did about 2.2 million cubic metres of storage, and it was kind of cost beneficial sort of unity when we looked at 30 different storm types. So averaged across those, we had about cost benefit ratio of 1, but then there's all the other benefits that are, the carbon storage and the diffuse pollution mitigation.
And that's the lifetime cost, is it, or is that the capital cost?
That was just capital, it wasn't maintenance,
Right.
which is one of the things that we're interested in as well.
Thank you. Michael Green from the Global Sustainability Institute. I was just sort of curious whether you'd consider sort of the structural performance of these systems, so whether they are prone to failure during very high events and sort of whole life performance, or whether that's something you're interested in or looking into currently.
Well, we've been trying to gather data on that. I showed a sort of JBA Trust geodatabase of where we've been trying to collect data on performance. So it does boil down to monitoring. So it is. These things look like they could fail in a big event, depending on where they're sited. It's something that it'd be good to sort of model. I don't know that many groups that are trying to model it.
Yes, so in discussing when Barry and Rob and I discussed the challenges, putting probability on the failures, we thought that was something which is really good for the study group. You could play around, get some reasonable numbers from Barry if he knows them, and then put that in the modeling, and that seemed to be that would be a novel thing to do.
Yeah, so we could build like a fragility curve, like might be done for a defence scheme.
Is there another question? Last question? Yes, there you go.
Hi there, I'm Oliver. I'm wondering about going back to the Winton example. You have the natural flood measures to try and attenuate and reduce the flow of water. Is it ever feasible to try and increase the speed of drainage away of the water, perhaps further downstream?
Yeah.
So if you were looking at this as an optimization, that would allow you to both decrease the flow rate or increase it, if that may be more desirable to, again, stop the synchronization.
Yeah, I mean, we've steered away from trying to speed things up in the neighbouring channel, but other groups are doing that. So I guess you could do it through what it might be called channel maintenance or dredging. That can have environmental impacts, but it might be a strategy. Yeah, it might be something that could be sort of looked at in the challenge.
Thank you.
I'm sure there are a lot more questions, but let's leave them for now. You can ask them during the tea, coffee, and the other breaks. Let's thank Barry for his presentation, and then tea and coffee.